guys, so I am here today to do a mid-month reading wrap-up for the month of October. I've been reading quite a lot this month, which means I already have 7 books to review that I've finished and 1 book that I didn't finish that I wanted to mention briefly as well. So rather than wait to the end of the month when I might have closer to 15 books and have to try and squeeze my reviews into one video, I thought I would do a mid-month wrap-up so that I could let you know my thoughts on these books, and then at the end of the month I will let you know my thoughts on the books I've read in the second half of the month. First up, let's start with Chalice by Robin McKinley. So this is a lovely little mass market paperback fantasy novel that I picked up recently in Forbidden Planet. And I haven't read any Robin McKinley previously to reading this, but she is one of those fantasy authors that comes up time and time again if you're looking for fantasy author recommendations, particularly if you like fantasy with female leads. She's just classic fantasy, and I have been meaning to read her for a while, and this one piqued my interest when I was in Forbidden Planet, and as soon as I bought it, it was one of those books I wanted to read immediately, so I did, and I very much enjoyed this novel. It's quite a quiet, slow, quaint fantasy novel in that it's not super dramatic or action-packed, although there is some like important things that happen in this and there's like an overarching narrative, but it doesn't feel particularly furious or fraught. Like I said, it feels quite quiet, but in a really nice way. Robin McKinley is an excellent writer, and I'll definitely be reading more of her fantasy books in the future. This one follows our protagonist, who has recently become Chalice for her piece of land. They're called Demesnes. I can't help but think of demes, which are the sort of ancient Greek word for sort of local areas, and I don't know if Demesnes is like a word actually other than in this book. I'll need to look it up actually. But they have these areas, a bit like villages or towns, and they live in this world where the magic system is that essentially the towns are very much in tune with the physical ground that they reside on, and there is a sort of council of magical people that help keep the relationship between the town and the land at its best, to help keep everything peaceful, to stop the ground cracking, to stop people's crops from failing, all of these kind of things. And she has the sort of second most important role in this council, but she's been kind of flung into, she wasn't expecting it because she was previously a beekeeper, and they have just appointed a new master. And now this master seems almost to not be human anymore. He was the previous master's younger brother, and he had gone away to join the fire priests, and he was in the process of becoming this fire priest, which kind of took him away from his humanity. So it's about her experience becoming this Chalice, trying to keep everything together, trying to figure out if the master can do his job, and her relationship with him and bonding with him, whilst people on the outside are trying to kind of make the most of this situation for themselves. And I loved the fact that she was a beekeeper for starters. I've never read a fantasy book with that element to it, and I thought it was really unique and really helped with the world building. I would love to read another book set in this world actually, but like I said, it has just quite a steady, quiet pacing, but you feel very invested in it, and I very much enjoyed reading it. On to some comic books now. I read Moonstruck Volume 1, which is a comic book I only just came across this month and had to pick up immediately because it sounded wonderful. It's set in a world like our own, except that humans live alongside kind of magical creatures. So our protagonist is a werewolf, there's centaurs, there's ghosts. It's all a mishmash, and everybody, you know, just lives harmoniously. This is the way the world is. As you can see on the back here, there's another character who has sort of like Medusa-like snake hair. There's the centaur character right there at the front, and our main character and her friends work in this coffee shop, and she's just started dating another young woman who is this character here, who's also a werewolf. And they're in the early stages of the relationship, everything's looking very promising. However, her friends and her new girlfriend and her get pulled into a sort of mystery that's going on when somebody is trying to steal the magical creature's magic. But it's not so much about that mystery plot, like that kind of ties it all together and gives it some structure and it's fun, but it's way more about the characters and their relationships, which are just fantastic. This is like the LGBTQ plus comic book of your dreams. There are, like I mentioned, relationships between women, there are other characters who are gay or bi or lesbian, there's also characters who are non-binary, and it's just wonderful. It's such an inclusive, representative comic book and I adored it. I also think the art is so gorgeous. It's kind of cutesy, but I really like it. I think the colour palette's gorgeous. I love kind of just getting to see what magical creatures are hanging around. It's funny. It also kind of explores kind of your feelings in different situations, so like the anxiety about new relationships and kind of treating people with respect, and I loved it. It's suitable for all ages and I would highly recommend you all check it out. I also read Paper Girls Volume 2, so this is one that I had read the previous volume to last year and really enjoyed and wanted to pick up Volume 2. This one, again, gorgeous art, very different kind of art, but equally stunning and fitting for what it is. This one originally starts in the 1980s and follows a group of paper delivery girls when they get sort of pulled into some science fiction mischief that's going on in their town, and there's a bit of an attack on where they live and it results in them time travelling. And this one's a bit more like dark and gritty, although the protagonists are children. It's a bit more like Stranger Things, and it's kind of got a lot of adult themes in there and it's quite intense. And I enjoyed this as much as the first one. I think if you enjoyed the first one, it's definitely worth checking out the second volume. Obviously I won't say too much because that would be spoilers, but it's a great series and I'm looking forward to picking up Volume 3. I also read Snot Girl Volume 1. This one I picked up after seeing Monica over at She Might Be Monica talk about, and I really like this one as well, whereas this one has much more mixed opinions on Goodreads from what I can tell, as opposed to Paper Girls, which seems to be kind of universally loved. This one, I again really like the art. It's fitting for the kind of what's going on in it. It's a bit more cutesy, a bit more like the first one, but different as well. This one follows Lottie Person, who's like a famous fashion blogger and Instagrammer, but she has terrible allergies that she doesn't want people to know about, so like when she goes outside the house she ends up like a snotty mess and she's scared that will ruin her image. And it's also just about all the things that are going on in her head, so she feels far more insecure than she comes across on the internet, and I found that very relatable. Like, I really like that. I think this comic book feels quite satirical to me in that it can kind of take the mickey out of kind of social media and influencers, but at the same time it's actually very honest in showing how social media is not the only side of people, and that people are deeper than that and that they have other stuff going on inside their head, and I really like that. But there's also like some super weird stalker mystery going on in the background that also keeps you hooked, and this left on a massive cliffhanger, so bring on Volume 2 is all I can say. And lastly, I'll just polish off the comic books. I read Ms. Marvel Volume 1. This is a superhero comic book, which I don't tend to go for, but this one had such high praise that I thought I would give it a shot and borrowed it from my library. This one follows our teenage protagonist, who is a young Muslim girl living in New York, and she basically discovers that she has superpowers. She can kind of change her shape, so she can shape-shift to look like different people. She can make herself bigger, she can make herself smaller. And she herself is obsessed with the Avengers, because this is set in the sort of overall Marvel universe where all of that stuff's going on, and she's always wanted to be a superhero, but now she is, and it's a bit like, how do you manage having a curfew and also having superpowers? And it's great fun. I really enjoyed this. Although I'm not usually a superhero person, I'm not like familiar with all of the different like Marvel incarnations, so I don't think you need to be either to read this one. You could just start here and jump straight in, and I'm definitely going to be again picking up Volume 2. Next up I'm going to mention poetry. So the first poetry collection I'm going to mention is the book that I DNF'd this month, and that is The Princess Saves Herself in This One by Amanda Lovelace. This is a poetry collection I got out of the library. I had sort of seen the title floating around but didn't really know much about the poetry inside, so I didn't want to buy it in case it wasn't my cup of tea, and it just wasn't my cup of tea at all. The title really drew me into this one. It really just, you know, it had like feminism written all over it, which I'm so down with, and I do think that the topics covered in this poetry collection and the points the poet is making, I like completely agree with. Like, nothing about the content was not working for me. It was the style of the poetry that wasn't working for me. And I would never deign to say that anything isn't poetry, because I'm sure some of the poetry I love now, 200 years ago, would have been not proper poetry. You know, there are various different styles of poetry and it's just not all for everybody, and this is not my kind of poetry. It's very brief, quite bare poetry. For me it felt more like reading a sentence or two that somebody had thought of, that had popped into their head and they just jotted down in a notepad. It was more of like little notes to the author's self. It didn't have what I enjoy from poetry, which is some rhythm. I like poetry that feels like music in your mouth. That's what I like. I like it just to be a bit meatier, whereas these were just, like I said, very bare, very short poems. And there is about 190 pages in this poetry collection, which is quite chunky, and I got to about page 70 and just thought, you know what, I've read about 70 poems of this, I'm still not into it, I'm not going to keep reading the next like 80 or 90 poems just for the sake of it. So I put this one down. I think some people adore it, as I can tell from the Goodreads reviews, and I think others of you won't enjoy it as much like I didn't. It just depends on your style, so I would look up a couple of the poems before you commit to picking this one up if you plan on buying it, because it might just not be your cup of tea like it wasn't my cup of tea. On the other end of the spectrum, however, I read a 5-star poetry collection, and that is City Psalms by Benjamin Zephaniah. I also got this one out of the library, but it was a real winner. This is a 5-star poetry collection, and it's not really surprising to me, as I already know I love Benjamin Zephaniah. This is not my first Benjamin Zephaniah collection. I adore everything he writes, and this was just like another massive box ticker for me. I actually think this might be my favourite poetry collection by him now that I've read it. It actually came out back in 1992, and these are just wonderful poems. These have what I want from poetry. They have rhythm, they have like real depth, but they're very accessible, and they're written in a way that they sound like the poet's speech. So they're not written per se in perfect English, they're written in, like, I forget the word, but you know when something is written down the way you say it, or the way that somebody says it. So they feel very natural and they feel very personal, they feel very unique to the author, and I really like that. I like the way that he plays with language in his poetry, and he makes just amazing political statements with his poetry. This is very political poetry, and I love that. So there are poems in here about police brutality, there is poems in here about war and bombs, there are poems in here about racism, there's a poem in here about The Sun, which is a newspaper in the UK, which has a tendency to be quite racist. Various different themes like that. No Rights Read and Half Dead, that's the poem which is about police brutality. But yeah, I just thought this was fantastic, fantastic, fantastic. Would highly recommend it to everybody. What more can I say? On audiobook, I listened to a second fantasy book in a series, which is Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Seanan McGuire. This is the sequel to Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire, which I liked conceptually, didn't love the execution of as much, but enjoyed the concept so much and was interested in the world that she was building that I thought I would give the second one a shot, and I'm glad I did, because I preferred Down Among the Sticks and Bones to Every Heart a Doorway. For me, Every Heart a Doorway, like I said, conceptually great, really interesting, but felt like too much was trying to be crammed into one space and it felt a bit rushed. Down Among the Sticks and Bones did not have that problem for me. It felt like the exact right amount of content for what is essentially a novella. Now what I mean by the concept is that this is set in a world like our own, where children often go to fairy realms, they cross over into different fairy worlds because there's not only one fairy world, and then when and if they return to the human world, they have trouble, you know, settling back into ordinary life. Some of them have been missing for years, their parents think they were probably dead, and they turn back up on their doorstep and all they can say is that they've been in a fairy world and nobody believes them. So their parents send them to this school where that sells itself as helping them readjust and kind of deal with whatever has happened to them, on the basis that they haven't actually gone to a fairy world. However, this school actually knows that they have gone to fairy worlds, so it brings all these kids together. And the sequel, Down Around the Sticks and Bones, follows two of the characters from the first book, but it goes back in time to when they were in their fairy world. So we meet them in the first book in this boarding school after they've returned, but it takes us back and gives us their backstory, and I really, really enjoyed it. I loved the construction of this world. The pacing worked a lot better for me. There's also some queer representation in there with a female-female romance, which Shauna Maguire is pretty good for. She had some asexual representation in the first book in particular that I can think of, and I enjoyed this one, which definitely means I'm definitely going to check out the third one in the series. And those are all the books that I have read so far in this half of the month. I have also just started a new book that I thought I'd briefly mention, because I will presumably be reviewing it in the second part of my monthly wrap-up at the end of the month, and that is Everything Under by Daisy Johnson. This is one of the Man Booker shortlist nominees, and I've heard nothing but great things, and so far they are completely standing up. This is a book where what comes through so much is the beautiful, eloquent prose. Now, Daisy Johnson this is her debut novel, but she's previously written short stories, and I definitely think I'll check out her short stories as well now, because her writing's just gorgeous. I'm about page 55 at the moment, and it's about 250 odd pages long, so I plan on finishing this one in the next part of the month, but I just thought I would mention it in here as well. Those are all the books that I have read in the first half of October, however. I hope you enjoyed this video. Do let me know if you have any thoughts on the books I have mentioned in this video, and I'll see you all again next time. Happy reading, bye!